differences between modern and traditional societies. And that wasn't really what the Oxford social anthropologists were about. They were more about studying the traditional societies of what we would now call the Global South. And so when Mary published her book on the Lele, nobody really realised its worth. It was partly that it wasn't about British colonial territories, but it was also partly because she was beginning to try to develop a more sociological theory, a theory which understood how ritual and values and beliefs intersected with social forms. And that, of course, was why she was a student of Evans Pritchard, who had done that work exactly in his famous study of the Nur of the Sudan. When we think about Mary Douglas more broadly, we recognise that she was one of a number of really spectacularly brilliant British social anthropologists who just happened to be women. The one who preceded her was Audrey Richards, born in 1899, and of course Mary Douglas herself, born in 1921, and perhaps now our greatest living anthropologist, Marilyn Strathern, born in 1941. So in that 40-year period, British social anthropology was blessed with three very spectacular women. Problem is that each one of them was, in a way, something of an outsider in their initial work. So Audrey Richards wrote Hunger and Work in a Savage Tribe, which wasn't the book that made her famous. And Marilyn Strathern's early work on Papua New Guinea were not the books that made her famous. And in fact, when we think about the relationship between modern and traditional societies, all three of those anthropologists were interested in one way and another of what the links between modern and traditional societies are and how we understand them. And their idea, I think, in part, reflected in their work and perhaps refracted through it also, was that we understand a great deal about ourselves from studying other societies.
Indeed, Purity in Danger, when it first came out, was received as a rather conventional text, in fact. And the furor around Mary's work didn't really get started until Natural Symbols came out 4 years later, which was received in a very different way from Purity in Danger. Natural Symbols was interpreted by many, and notably by Edmund Leach, as a piece of Catholic apologetics, and that Mary Douglas had basically put her anthropology in the service of her Catholic beliefs, because the book was interpreted, rightly in fact, in part as a reaction to the Second Vatican Council, and the early chapters of it had been delivered under the title The Contempt of Ritual, which was a rejection on Mary's part of the reforms to Catholic ritual that had been proposed through the Second Vatican Council. So the reputation was made by Purity in Danger, but something of the notoriety of the mid-period of Mary's work was provoked by Natural Symbols when it came out in 1970.
What happened with Purity in Danger was that it worked through a set of ideas which professional social anthropologists understood. So they, when they reviewed the book, said, well, we already know this, which is always a great danger in intellectual life anyway, that's how your books will be reviewed by your peers. But, of course, for other people outside anthropology, this was opening up anthropological thinking, and it allowed them to attach those ideas to their own work. So it was powerful in that regard. When we come to Natural Symbols, you're right, we're dealing with something where Mary Douglas begins to reflect through a variety of means on this question of how we learn about ourselves by reflecting on others. Now, I'm not surprised that Edmund Leach actually said that she'd been a Catholic apologist. He also accused me of being biased towards my own work because I had published a book called Feminism and Anthropology. And when I replied to him on that point, I made the point that I would also make about Mary Douglas's work, which is to say that if you articulate a passion and a position and you follow it through in your work, your reader is able to understand where you're starting from and why you take that particular position. If, on the other hand, you constantly just provide an idea that your work is subjective and has no connection at all to your own position in life or your own beliefs or your own values, you imply that it is completely objective and not in any way associated with any of your prejudices, which, of course, is always misleading.
And of course, and the difference between Purity in Danger and Natural Symbols reinforces that, because in Purity in Danger, Mary Douglas is fundamentally pursuing a difference between them and us. Contemporary societies are much more reflexive. They think about the basis of their own beliefs and so forth. By Natural Symbols, she's got rid of that distinction, and she is basically saying them and us are just the same.
Yes, that's right. And I think that that's one of the strengths of her work that carries over into the contemporary moment. And contemporary anthropology, of course, is made up of a number of very sharply divided theoretical positions. But one part of it is this idea that there are universals in human cognition, that the importance of ritual, the importance of making sense of your experience is something that we all share as humans. And that's something that was extremely important to Mary Douglas. And she believed, I think, that people in every part of the world are as capable of metaphysics as Catholic theologians.
She also believed that the variety between types of society was as great in the contemporary world as it had been in the past. And so I remember when I was a student of hers in the early 1970s, listening to her lectures, she lectured on what she called secular savages. And here she was responding to the work of the French sociologists of the late 19th century, the Année Sociologique school, who assumed that there was a greater deal of religiosity in small-scale societies. And Mary was fascinated by the instances of African societies that were small in scale, but apparently not very religious at all. And so she had the distinction between secularized societies on the one hand and ritualized societies on the other, applying as much to them as it did to us. And this was part of the basis that she later developed as an argument against the idea that Western societies were becoming increasingly secularized, which was something that she didn't accept. And she didn't accept it in the 1970s, which was a time when most other theorists, in fact, did accept that. Few would accept it now. But in the 1970s, that was a conventional view.
And also at the time when she was writing, she was, I think, speaking out against this evolutionary idea that had crept into anthropological thinking, that small societies somehow started with magic and witchcraft and then progressed through religion, and then you ended up with really sophisticated societies who didn't have any religions at all. And I don't think that many anthropologists would agree with that now, especially as we see how relevant her work would be to understanding, if you what we might call the return of religion in contemporary society. So when both you and I started out as social scientists, we were basically taught and brought up, if you like, in the tradition that modern societies were becoming increasingly secular and that religion would somehow disappear. And then we, like everyone else in societies around the world, find ourselves in a situation where religion has returned with enormous force. And we are somehow unprepared for this. And we're unprepared because in many places the religion that we see is not the one that we expected, or not the one that we thought was dying. So, for example, one thing that's very important in contemporary Africa is Christianity. Perhaps Africa is the most Christian continent in the world now. And Mary would have understood that because when she first started her work on the Lele, although they appeared to be a small group of people living in the middle of the Belgian Congo, they were already significant Christian converts by the time she did her work in the late 1940s. And I think she understood very clearly that people give up on ideas of how to deal with the kinds of experiences we have in life, how to make sense of them. We have to have some set of values and beliefs that we apply to these things, and that we can't just draw those values and beliefs from ourselves. We must have some connection in some sense to a transcendent being or beings or sets of principles which are larger than we are. And I think she wouldn't have been at all surprised to see the return of religion.
Henrietta, you remarked on the 3 generations of very important women anthropologists and were too modest to put any further generations after that. Let's put Mary back into that context. There were lots of women anthropologists. They weren't necessarily heads of department. They didn't necessarily get to the highest position. But being a woman didn't per se make you an outsider. But Mary was an outsider in a more complex sense, that she was both a woman anthropologist and also a cradle Catholic. And therefore her faith was a matter of loyalty, belonging. And she used a lot of images to do with what we would call gut feelings. So when she talked about natural symbols, her point was not, as she's been misquoted as saying sometimes, that symbols are natural, but symbols must appear natural. And that's really important. As a woman anthropologist, I wonder really to what extent she was ever a feminist. She had some very strong ideas about the way in which women's roles should be differentiated from men's within hierarchical organisations, and the kinds of powers that women should have. And these powers should be differentiated from those of men.